Previously, I constructed a custom mantle to fit over the recently remodeled fireplace. Here's how I finished the entire remodel project. I had to decide what kind of stain to use. I wanted to match some of the other furniture I've made in the past, such as the bar cabinet and cat shelves, but I couldn't remember what color I used. So I took one of the scrap cutoffs from the build and tested a few of the stains I had. The first stain is called Carrington, and the other is called dark walnut. The Carrington seems to have a bit of red in it, which clearly doesn't match the existing stain. The dark walnut is the clear winner. I didn't have enough stain to cover the entire mantle, and it was old and chunky anyway, so I picked up a fresh new can and got to work. This mantle was too big to stain all at once, so I stained it in sections. I first applied a heavy layer of stain with a foam brush, let it sit for a minute or two to soak in, then wiped it off with paper towels. When wiping off the stain, I wiped with the grain, making sure there weren't any streaks and checking to make sure everything was coated evenly. It was a bit difficult to cleanly stain the inside of the mantle, but I just had to do smaller sections at a time. And I just had to make sure not to go too heavy where I overlapped sections, or else it would look funky. I had to wait till the next day to stain the back of the face piece and the back of the mantle. I probably didn't need to stain the back of the mantle because it'll be pressed against a wall, but just for good measure, I did it anyway. When all the stain was applied and cured, I began applying the protective coat. I put on 3 layers of semi-gloss polyurethane. This is really making the mantle look so good. After the second coat, I did a light sanding on the entire thing with 320 grit sandpaper. This smoothed out any imperfections in the polyurethane coats. I thoroughly vacuumed all the surfaces to get rid of all the dust, then applied the third and final layer. We're getting much closer to finishing the mantle. I could finally mount the door, but I needed to decide on the kind of hinges. The first set of hinges I tested were close, but not quite right. I needed the door portion to completely overlap the frame portion. This hinge didn't quite do that. So I picked up another type of hinge, and this one worked much better. As an added bonus, this new hinge was also a soft close. Since this door is pretty heavy, and I wanted it to be supported well, I used 4 hinges spaced out over the length of the door. The hinges come with templates showing where to drill the holes. One by one, I followed the template and installed all 4 hinges. These hinges would help close the door softly, but I also needed a way to open the door softly, so it wouldn't drop suddenly and potentially rip the hinges out. I found this door accessory at the Rockler store near me that is a soft drop and support for doors exactly like this. The first time I installed it, it was just slightly off its ideal location. So I pulled out the screws, made a small adjustment, and reinstalled it. With the door on, the mantle was now completed. All that was left was mounted on the wall. But before doing that, I needed to run the cables through the wall. I pulled the covers off the access ports to make the openings more accessible, then laid out all the cables that I'd run through the wall. Most of them were HDMI cables, but also a few RCA and audio cables as well. I first ran a string from top to bottom and tied all the ends of the cables to the string to yank through. However, the header beam behind the lower opening didn't allow enough clearance for all the ends at once, so I decided to pull the cables through one by one. It was a bit time consuming, but beauty takes work, right? It was finally time to mount the mantle. It took two of us to do it easily. Bree set her side on the top lip, and I held it up as she shoved all the lower cables through the back. We then centered it over the fireplace, making sure the gap between the mantle and the frame on either side was the same. When it was in place, I popped a few screws to hold it up. We then got our first glimpse at the finished mantle, finally in place. And dang, does it look good. Let go.
Nice. Okay. I'm so nervous.
It's fine, it'll...
You sure?
Yeah.
You sure it's centered?
Yeah. Lots of measurements along the way
Okay.
to make sure that's centered.
Shut it. Oh, wow.
It's really big, babe.
Alright, I'm gonna put some more screws in.
Okay.
I finished putting all the screws in to hold it to the wall. I countersunk all the holes so the screws would be flush with the wood. I eventually put caps on the screws to hide them. The weight of the mantle mostly rests on the shelf below it. The screws hold it in place and keep it from falling. It was time to mount the TV. I forgot to remark the studs and mounting location after painting the shiplap, but luckily, if I got really close to the wall, I could just barely see the location of the screws, so I could figure out where the studs were. This mount called for 4 large lag bolts to go right into the studs. The TV we currently have is fairly small, but the mount is able to hold a much larger and heavier TV, in case we decide to upgrade in the future. Before putting the TV up, I finished the access hole and put the faceplate on. The tricky part about putting the TV on was connecting all the cables. It was easier to connect the cables first, then hook the TV on the mount. I'd say it looks pretty good with all the cables hidden behind the TV. Now that everything above was finished, I could now finish up the inside of the mantle. I started with the router and internet. The router is sitting on the inside of the mantle. We use a mesh network system, and I wanted the device for that to be on top of the mantle for best performance. I utilized one of the holes on the top to connect it to the router and to power. When that was all set, I reconfigured the wires in the attic to connect to the new outlet. I had already done the work of running new connection cables. All I needed to do here was a simple switcheroo. And just like that, the internet was up and running in the new spot. One of the last things to do was connect all the gaming consoles inside the mantle. One by one, I connected them to power and to one of the many HDMI cables. Most of these consoles have been gifted to either my wife or I over the years. So now we have quite the collection. From left to right, it goes PlayStation 3, PlayStation 2, Super Nintendo Classic, N64, and Xbox One. I haven't been playing video games much lately, but with this new setup, I'm gonna have to make some more hours in the day. Here's a good look at how smoothly the mantle door opens and closes. I'm pretty stoked with how it both soft drops and soft closes. Now that the mantle is all set up and complete, we had to do a flip of the room to face the new direction. All that took was to move a bit of furniture around. Most importantly, we gave the floor a really good cleaning in the process. And with that, this fireplace renovation is complete. I'd say it's a pretty significant step up from before. This completely changes the focus and feel of the room. Back when we moved in, it looked like this. And now, it looks like this. Quite the change, huh? Eventually, we'll get some sort of cover for the fireplace opening, but at the current moment, it's not really necessary because it's not going to be a working fireplace. Okay, that's it for now. See ya.